to the Brave Feminine Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Hamilton, and we get to dig into delicious conversations with global leaders, and we get to soak up their wisdom and perspective on life and leadership. And I could not be more thrilled today to be joined here by Bernie Brookes. Bernie, welcome.
Thanks, Melissa. Appreciate the opportunity.
So you probably don't need much of an intro, Bernie, but I'm going to share your bio very briefly anyway. So for those of you that don't know, Bernie Brookes is a managing director / CEO with expertise and substantial experience in retail and wholesale operations, buying, information technology systems, supply chain and human resource management in a fast-moving and dynamic environment. An experienced board member and chair of large and complicated companies in private equity, international corporates and small startups. That's a lot to fit in. I know there's a massive career in there, Bernie, and you're still incredibly active. And so I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Can I ask you, Bernie, can you share with us, who are you as a human being? And let's get into your career and your journey.
Sure. So I we were what we would call 10-pound poms, arriving in the mid-60s into Australia, and went to East Hills Migrant Hostel, myself, two brothers and mum and dad. And that was a great decision that mum and dad made to move to the UK. So no silver spoon here. We lived at the East Hills Migrant Hostel for quite a few years before we could move out. And from that, one of my brothers went on to be a school teacher, and I had the same aspirations. So Macquarie Uni, finished uni, and then was going to be a school teacher. Tried that for about 6 months, didn't really enjoy it. And during that time, I was putting myself through Safeway, Woolworths at that stage, and decided that I'd pursue a retail career, and did exactly that. My brother went on to be a successful school teacher and headmaster, etc. But I decided that I'd go retail. So joined the Woolies group, initially at Safeway, then Woolies, and then some of their divisions, and spent the next 28 years at Woolies across a multitude of businesses, including 3 years in China, working and living in China, setting up a whole lot of sourcing offices and network through Shanghai and Guangzhou and Hong Kong and even India. And then spent 3 years working in India in a joint venture between Woolworths and the Tata family, which was a great education, and then returned to Australia again, and then moved across different states in Woolworths, eventually becoming running various divisions of Woolies over a period of time. 2006, I'd had 28 years and decided that I'd look at becoming the group CEO at that stage. So Roger Corbett was retiring. I was unsuccessful in that. I was the sort of runner-up to Michael Luscombe, who was a very good man. And so at the end, I decided I was going to leave and probably take things a little bit easier. So 2006, I left, got a knock on the door from Texas Pacific Group, which were a large private equity company, who were looking to buy Myer, and then spent the next sort of 6 months working on the Myer proposal, and then eventually they bought Myer, and I run Myer then for the next sort of 9 years. The conclusion of that 9 years, which took me through to about 2014, again, I was going to finish up, but then had a call from Bain in London, Bain Private Equity, and ended up going to Africa for 3 years to run the largest retail group there, which was a bit like, think of Wesfarmers, except it was called Edcon. Financially distressed, laden with debt, another great education, and spent sort of just over 3 years in that business. Then I came back to Australia, and then subsequent to that, I now have a multitude of roles. I work for Champ Private Equity and some of their investments, chair sort of one listed and 4 other companies. So I have now 5 CEOs that report to me. 1 or 2 of those I fully own, 1 or 2 of those I have small shares in and run, and with a listed company, obviously, which keeps my hand into listed space. I run a number of awards and programs and mentor a few people, including 2 or 3 that run various startups. So quite diverse, moved from sort of big corporate world to probably a smaller scale businesses, but fun and a lot more of now chairing things rather than day-to-day running of businesses. So hopefully that gives you a pretty sort of fulsome update.
Well done. You may have had to do that before, Bernie, I think, like how succinctly you stepped through what's been an incredible career. So the first thing that occurs to me out of that is every single time you decided that you were going to step back and take it easy, a rather monumental challenge came your way.
Yeah, yeah, and they were too. They were. I mean, Myer was a business that was losing $66 million when we carved it out of Myer, and we took it to an IPO at making sort of 250 to 300 million. And then similarly, the scenario in Africa was that 28 billion in turnover, 30 billion in debt, 4 billion in interest payments, and 2.5 billion in profit. So it was not solvent, and so that was financial re-engineering and restructuring as a challenge. And then when I came back again, getting involved in a couple of companies that were in VA and trying to help them. So the concept of a chase or a challenge has always been something that's sort of got my antennas up and attractive to me, rather than just running something that's mundane and cruising along.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Bernie, what was it, if we go right back to that decision to forge a career in retail, what was it that, and I'm going to assume you fell in love with retail to, still be so active in the space today. What was it about the space that really grabbed you?
Yeah, I think the one facet of retail that's often underestimated is the multifaceted nature of it. So, I think mum and dad would have been happy if I'd have said I was going to be a lawyer or I was going to be a doctor or I was going to be a teacher. But the issue there is you've got one stream in life,
Mm.
whereas retail is financial, supply chain, IT, it's buying product, it's marketing, it's leadership. It's so multifaceted that you become a lot more of a generalist and you become a lot more knowledgeable of a lot of different areas. And it's the same career advice I give to people today, that if you're going to go straight up a tree and be the best accountant, then chief financial, and then eventually move through to be a CFO, that's one stream. And that's what you want to do, that's great. But mine was branching out into various branches and learning all of that. And funnily enough, each of those roles I've had at one time, where I've been head of supply chain or a senior role in IT or in any of those aspects. So I think the one real attraction to retail is it's dynamic, but added to that, it's multidimensional.
Did you think you always wanted to be a CEO?
Oh no, I think there's not many people that are born and think, I want to be a CEO of a company. I think there's a lot that may have aspirations, but I don't think you're born with that belief. And I'd say that it becomes more incremental and step by step. During my early Woolworths career, I started as pushing trolleys, and my next step then was I wanted to be work on a checkout, and then my next step then was I thought, wow, it'd be good to be in the cash office, and then the next one it'd be nice to be a department manager in liquor, and then an assistant store manager, and then a store manager, and then it'd be nice to go to head office and be a trainee buyer, and off it went from there. And I think you set yourself short and medium term goals, but you never know where the ceiling is and whether there is a ceiling. And I think people today get too stressed and hung up over wanting to jump those 5 steps and be the leader tomorrow without realizing the stepping stones to get there. And I was quite happy to get to each stepping stone. And I also had the motto that whatever the company wanted me to do, I would do.
Mm.
And you trusted that if you looked after the company, they would look after you. Now, that belief's not as prevalent today with redundancies and cutbacks and the digital world and everything that's changed. But I do think that you've set yourself an ambition that is incrementalized, and then effectively you can move through that rank. And that worked great until they said, we'd like you to go to China or we'd like you to go to India. But I took those moves knowing that the company would look after me if I did the right thing by them. And funnily enough, that worked out. So I think you never say, I'm going to be a CEO. I think you say, I'm ambitious to get to the next step. And if I do a good job, then hopefully I can progress further.
And I might get some bigger problems to work on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Bernie, okay, so when did it become, though, when do you think that seed was first planted that it was possible for you to become CEO?
Yeah, I think I'll call it the self-actualization occurs in a multitude of ways in life. And that self-actualization comes from the fact that where you have an initial ambition to be a store manager or a buying and marketing chief, that you then look ahead and think, well, I've learned all these skills, so there's nothing stopping me having some ambition to get to the next step. And you get plenty of failures. You might miss out on a role, you might miss out on a job, someone might be in front of you, or you might be doing something you don't enjoy. But ultimately, you have that sort of realization that I can do this and I can therefore take the next step. And you're always looking at your peer and you're always looking at the person that you report to. And people then say to themselves, can I do that job? And some people I've interviewed said, I could never do that job and I never want to do that job. But others might say that initially, but then they realize that they've got the capability and the worth to be able to do it. So I think you gather it through doing the job you're doing good and realizing there is a next step. And I think the second thing is I'm a big fan of sort of self-education, and that means that I take myself off to courses, I run online training, look at online training programs, and I read an enormous amount. That's the three pieces of advice I give to some of the young guys that I mentor. So in saying that, I think you've got to be able to then educate yourself in the skill gaps you've got. And then you realize that you've got the capability and you've filled the gaps where you don't have the capability to be able to aspire to take the next steps in your career journey.
Did someone tell you early on that they could see you leading a company?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to have a couple of people like Paul Simons and people like Roger Corbett, but probably more so Reg Clears, who were all three CEOs of Woolies at the time, that said, you'd have no trouble progressing and being a leadership having part of a senior leadership in the company. And so that also gave me a bit of wind behind me, or sort of tailwinds to get a bit more ambitious with things, because again, you've got self-actualization, but you also need praise to be able to look at it with a different set of eyes, and that was certainly the case.
Did you get any tough feedback along the way? Like I often say to people, at stages in your career, there's feedback that you don't really want to hear, but ultimately is pretty important for you. Can you think of anything?
Oh yeah, I think you might not like it at the time.
Yeah.
You might not even believe it at the time, but then you do realize that feedback was invaluable. And it's probably made me more convinced that in the performance reviews and the people that report to me and the people I have a lot to do with, I try and give them that same degree of frank and important feedback, because as I said, you might not like it, might feel a bit unpalatable, but at the end, it's for the better and for their greater good. So, I received feedback that I was too over administratively doing things. I was trying to get everything 100% right, a little bit of a perfectionist. I would come to meetings with copious notes. I would, over minute things. I would produce lists of things to do. And I pride myself in being quite organized and orchestrated, but at the same time, sometimes you can let that drive you administratively rather than have confidence in making quick and speedy decisions and gut feel. And it took me a long time to feel confident enough to do that. But I would get feedback that I was just, far too over administratively. And I think the second thing you learn is that concept of time management and prioritization. And early in your career, and when you're aspiring to be a CEO, you glut your diary with so much, and you then work at night to return emails. And we've all done it, and we've all fallen into that trap, and you do fall into that trap, and you have to, because resources are pretty limited these days. But in saying that, I think you can learn and get feedback that there's an opportunity to leave time in your diary for thinking time. There's time to manage your own agenda and do some things that you want to do, and balance those sort of aspects. So yeah, getting that feedback hurt in a nice way, and it turned out to be nice because it actually gave me some really good listening and handling skills and coping skills going forward.
So into the first CEO role then officially with Myer, so taking up the reins at Myer, I'd just love to hear, do you recall, and I ask this of a lot of CEOs, do you recall the first day, the first week, what do you recall as those first moments in the role?
I think people that get their first CEO role in a decent sized company always remember that early session. I think If I look back now, I think that when you become a CEO, you demand respect because you've got the title of CEO. And so therefore you get a nice office, you might get an EA, you might get someone to make the coffee instead of you making the coffee all the time. And, things are prepared for you and briefing sheets are prepared for you. And that takes you back a little bit because you've not had that before. And that I call the command respect stage. And then I always remember my objective was to no longer command respect by being a CEO, but to demand it by who I am and what I do and what action I take. And so you still feel like you've got to prove yourself to those people around you who say he's the CEO or she's the CEO. What is that? What are they going to do? And the other thing that I think that surprised me a little bit, people are always looking at you and to you rather than you're part of a team. And you're in a meeting and they'll look at you for a decision, and you get a note that you've got to sign off on something, and so you have a much accelerated and much more relevant importance and responsibility, and people are reliant upon you. And the last sort of realization I think you get very early on was you become a little bit frightened that if you make the wrong decision,
Yes.
that you might have 30 or 40,000 jobs at stake. You might have the shareholders' obligations at stake, and you have your own personal reputation at stake. So I guess the rewards are great, but what comes with it is the acceleration of risk, the acceleration of responsibility, the need for you to prove yourself to your peers and to all of the stakeholders. And so it can be a little bit frightening, exhilarating, but at the same time, I think there's a realization that you've got to earn the respect of those around you.
How did you deal with, you often hear CEOs talking about it's the first time you're in a role where you don't have a peer group. So there is a level of isolation in that. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, it's not as well as what I think CEOs do today. So I chair two syndicate groups today of the CEO Institute, and I have about a dozen CEOs in that group. And the CEO Institute's a marvelous institution, and in the sense that the CEOs come along for 4 or 5 hours, and we talk about problems that they've got, and they're exchanging ideas across 12 other CEOs in non-related industries. So therefore, it may be I've got a problem with a board member, I've got a problem with an executive, I've got an unfair dismissal, I've got a fair work hearing, I've got a cultural issue, I don't have a strategy, I've got new competitors. And whatever the topic is, it's those topics that a CEO might not be able to raise with their executive group or their board because they risk of showing their own inadequacies.
Yes.
Alternatively, they're getting the company statement, but they can raise it within that peer group and get really good feedback. Try this, I've done that. And there's a great learning in education. So that's an example, I think, of what I really wish I'd have had early on. But to answer your question more fully, I did rely on a couple of confidants that I could bring external to the business and internal to the business. And today I'm that confidant for a couple of CEOs in listed and unlisted companies that say, look, I've got to do a strategy day, run me through how you've done it and what you've done. Or a recent call was, I've got this business that I've just become CEO of, and I'm not sure where to start. What do you think? What's a 100-day plan look like, and what should it be? So I do think that you can effectively, use people external to the business as mentors, advocates, supporters. I call them guns for hire, that I can ring them up and talk to them.
Yes.
So I think that all of that effectively means it's a great opportunity to learn early on. I didn't have that, and I had to sort of self start and figure it out myself. But I started to use some of those advocates, and that was demonstratively different to try and solve all the problems myself.
I'm super interested in this with you, Bernie, because I see sort of two styles of CEOs, and I fear as I describe this that early in my tenure I was the first style, and that was when it came to my broader executive team. I kind of controlled the narrative with the board. I really made sure that there was a channel that I had control of, I guess. And then I see other CEOs who I think are very open, and, there's zero barriers whatsoever through the teams to the board. What were you, and did that change through your career?
Yeah, I had previous CEOs that I'd worked for that were very strong on controlling the message to the board and the stakeholders, to the extent that it was a form of fibbing. It wasn't quite giving full information.
I don't think I did that.
No, and don't take it that way. But there are people that could have ensure that the coloured nature of what's said to the board and what's said to stakeholders can cause an issue. And so for me, I've gone flip-flop the opposite way, and I'll provide the warts and all analysis to the board. And I do have some CEOs that very much like to control the messaging and the board, and I become the sort of the devil on the left-hand side of their shoulder to say, no, you need to give them all the facts, all the information, and all the details. So I think what has changed is that that sort of limited sharing of information. And I think the regulation and requirements and governance have actually enthused that, because the board have got just as much responsibility today as the CEO in regard to strategy, governance, solvency, rights on workplace health and safety, on emissions, you name it. And the board are a lot more on the hook. And so therefore, if you're the person that doesn't share the information with them, then it lets them off the hook to some extent. But also, I think what it does, it puts greater amount of pressure and responsibility on the CEO. So a problem solved is a problem best shared. And I think that's the attitude that you've got to take with the board, rather than keeping them under a rock and only giving them specific and certain coloured information.
Bernie, you spend a lot of time with CEOs today, and I know you're very active in mentoring, a large number of executives. How early can you spot CEO potential?
If you'd have asked me that question sort of 10 years ago, I'd have probably said, very hard to do. But I do think today it's a lot easier. My prior call to this was with a young lass that I've been working with and helping, and she was a previous winner of the Joe Berry Award, and she's an exceptional talent, and I have no doubt in the world that she will go on to be a CEO of a large to medium-sized company. She's got that skill. You can identify competence, you can identify their ability to work as a team, you can identify their integrity, you can identify their creativity, you can identify their communication skills, and I think you can identify all of those things, and also their ability to work as an individual. And they're the sort of, let's call it the foundation stones of a CEO. And she's self-starting. And I think those traits that make a good CEO can be identified very early, and can be identified at any age and of any sex. And therefore, I think it becomes a lot easier to not to tell them necessarily, but to put a star above their head to say, these guys are going to be fairly significant players going forward. And therefore, I find I spend a little bit more time with them to make sure they get there.
Now, you were, speaking of the Joe Berry Award, you were the first winner of that in 1986. And I know that as this podcast comes out, you'll be close to looking at accepting people to apply for that for 2025. So what is it about that award that keeps you, why do you stay so close to that one?
Yeah, it's a great award. There've been sort of 35 winners, and most of them, when I look back at the alumni, have gone on to run companies and have been high achievers mainly in retail, but in other industries as well. So ideally, it's great to see the development of young executives. And in a time when a lot of the other retail awards fell off during that period, there was about 3 others. This is really the only significant retail-based industry award in FMCG food, in the food environment. And so therefore, it's one that's worth keeping. But the part is, it's incredibly uplifting to sit there for the judging day and watch the 6 finalists present their view on really topical things. So you get educated, It's like going back to university for a day. So I think firstly, and reading the papers is an education. So the first is the education. The second is, and it's an haggard phrase, but it's important, is giving back. I mean, the industry has been enormous for me, been a great opportunity. It's taken me from being a trolley boy to running large companies internationally. And I think, therefore, there's an obligation and a responsibility to give back to an industry that's been so good to me. And I think the third aspect is it's just so good to see that a lot of the previous winners want to learn and want to develop, and they want to get ahead, and they're prepared to take advice. And I might spend time with some of the alumni, and you talk to them and you can see, I'm doing this because I'm supposed to do it, and I don't really want to be here, and there's nothing I want to know from you. And you get others that are like sponges that come back and say, I've done this, and I've done that, I've looked at this. So I think to some extent, it's that giving back, it's that uplifting nature, it's the educational component, it's all of the above that make it a tremendous award. And finally, the sponsors and the judges are equally obliged and interested in giving back as well. And so you've then got a group of people that love it, and we all say sometimes it's our highlight of the year to sit there on the judging panel. And that's Coca-Cola and Unilever and all of Mars and all of the major companies. And the alumni is also good. I have alumni meetings, and they're really good as well, where you see how everyone's going and how they're progressing, and they bounce off each other. So it's a perfect combination of a sort of mentoring come education come development program that gives you a real spark in your day.
So is there a Bernie Brookes kind of magic move as a CEO? What do you think is the most impactful thing that you've done? What's the thing you're proudest of?
I think that I call it dialing up or dialing down. And, I think a CEO often underestimates the importance of being able to go to the warehouse and talk around to the guys and girls in the warehouse and talk about the footy and talk about what's happening, and then jump and be with analysts and investors on a very different dialogue, and then walk the stores and read the stores from the point of view of the culture and the style, and read people's difficult situations. So I think the ability to dial up or dial down is important. You see CEOs that are very set in their ways. They don't change their dialogue, their dialect. They don't change their metabolism, their emotion for the audience and the situation. And so I think, that I call it a filing cabinet of skills and communication methodology that you've got. And I think people don't use that enough, and they'll stay within their lane where you have to step out of your lane. And, there's no better example than being in South Africa amongst the Wagner or the Zulu tribes in a country location in the middle of South Africa or Swaziland or any of the 17 countries that we were in. And you have to learn that there's a different dialogue. You have to learn that most of the communication is done through dancing and singing, and you've got to be careful what you say and how you say it. And so you've got to change your whole thought process of what you do and say. And so I think that the one skill that you hone is that dialing up, dialing down, and changing the way you approach things for the circumstance and the emotions on hand.
Can I ask, if you were faced with a decision of bringing in a couple of executives into your business, and you had a older but tried and true executive, brilliant leadership skills with a great track record, or you had, excuse me as I lose my voice here, everyone, an up and coming executive, who are you choosing and why?
I think you've got to look at the mix. So if you've got an executive group that is made up of tried and true, proven, good track record executives, then you'd probably be looking for someone that was going to develop from a succession point of view, and someone that was going to have a different perspective on things. So not a straightforward answer in the sense that it depends upon your current mix. But, I've recently employed a CFO in one of my businesses that's in his late 50s, early 60s. And after I appointed him, he said to me, I didn't think you'd appoint me because I'm sort of at the end of my career. And I said, well, I know I'm going to get 5 or 6 really good years out of you because you're experienced, compared to I could have got the 35-year-old that didn't have the full capability set, but probably 18 months' time was going to ping off and go to another job because it was more money and more ambition. I said, so and that's the mix aspect that's really important. But I think that there is still an age prejudice that exists in recruitment, big time, and so therefore I'm probably the antichrist that have moved against that, and I'd rather have a mix of grey hairs and I'll use the phrase and young'uns
Yes.
that give me a really good mix in the executive team, and I think the mix is the important aspect.
Now, Bernie, we're seeing some good change here, and I think in retail there's been some good change, in particular recently across our supermarket chains. But traditionally, female CEOs, it's been kind of slow to move, not so many. What's your perspective on that?
I think there has been an enormous prejudice. And I won't say where or who, but I've been in boardrooms where it's been said that, we've got two people for a job, a female and a male. Let's not take the female because she's going to go off and have babies.
Yeah.
Or let's not take the female because she's got to look after the kids. Let's not take the female because, she's emotional. And, I don't hear that, fortunately, anymore. But I do think there has been an inequality and a social barrier that has required nearly a generational change to accelerate the rate of change and have a more impartial and balanced view. And I think today that sort of cultural barrier, it still exists a bit, but I think as the next generation comes through, it's not going to be there anymore. And I'll give you a somewhat related example. I have 5 grandchildren, and one of them is sort of 9, and she's a wonderful young kid. And she's got her best friend who's Indian. She's got another best friend who's a boy. She's got another best friend who's an Asian. And it's all irrelevant to her when you talk to her what the color of their skin is or what the sex is. But when I was at school, it was quite different. You had a group over there and a group over there, and the boys were separate to the girls, and different games were played. So I think it takes that generation change for the realization that the world will be a much better place and business will be better as we are a lot more balanced in regard to gender and race and everything else that was caused segregation and an illogical movement in people to a glass ceiling. So I think the refreshing part now is it's changing at a rapid rate. We know it's got a long way to go, but it's a generational change, and we're seeing it, and I think pleasingly seeing it, and I think it will continue, that this topic probably won't be a topic that's discussed in 20 years' time.
I hope not. Yeah, we'll be well and truly moved on by then. Bernie, a lot of the executives that I spend time with, when you boil down to what holds them back from potentially making a move of some sorts, often it comes down to fear of other people's opinions.
Yeah, and look, it was early in my career, it was important. I think when you're a high-profile CEO in a company like Myer, you're picking up the paper and it's got a cartoon of you that's grossly unfair. I collected them. I have them in frames. There were 62 of them produced during my time.
Wow.
And those 62 cartoons appeared in the paper. And at one stage I was holding a bag of money, and at other times I'd look like I'd been beaten up, and the other one I was getting pushed off a cliff by Julia Gillard, and I could go through the whole lot. And I learned from that not to take yourself too seriously. And you learn that life is full of criticisms that are unfair and unjust. Early on in your career, it can really affect you. However, you soon learn that, and then you get a great write-up about what a great job you've done by financial journalists. So you learn to become resilient. You learn to always use the phrase that, I've got a shield of steel and I'll let it bounce off me, because otherwise you go bonkers, because it gets into your head and you can really worry about it. So I think the most important thing is, if you can say that you're staying true to yourself, that you've made the decision that you thought was right at the time, and that you've taken advocacy and you've listened and you've understood the other side, then you go forward with the true knowledge that you have made a decision that you believe is right, despite the fact that others don't. and you reserve your right to accept their criticism, but you reserve your right to ignore their criticism.
Top 3 things you'd say to a new CEO?
I think educate yourself, and continue to educate yourself. I think the second aspect is you've got to win the hearts of the company, and you've got to win the hearts of the individual. And the third aspect is you have to be humble. And it's an old phrase, but it's being gentlemanly. And you should make the coffee. You should be the one that drives the car. Once you become that arrogant, standoffish CEO, is the day you will lose advocacy. People that work for you, individuals that work in all different environments, will bring you down if you demonstrate a degree of arrogance and a degree of know-it-all nature. So I think humility becomes a really important trait. And if you look at CEOs that have been run out of companies and you look at the DNA of them, invariably it's because they've demonstrated an arrogance, an inability to listen, and a cockiness that has meant that they are more right than anyone else. And they've got that inability to listen. And so I think, my 3 messages are: maintain that humility and gentlemanliness, learn and listen and educate yourself, and work towards winning the hearts and minds of the staff and all of the stakeholders.
Amazing. It makes me think of, I don't know what AFL allegiance you have, if any, but my family are all Cats supporters, and it makes me think of, the Joel Selwoods and Tom Hawkins of the group, who are always the one called out for, cleaning up in the change rooms, not expecting anyone else to clean up after them. And good advice, works all around. So when you reflect back on leaving the CEO role, and you've left a couple of CEO roles, inevitably saying you're ready to slow down, but we're yet to see that happen yet. As you reflect back on the CEO roles, are there things you would have done differently?
Yeah, I think you do compromise your family. And I defy any CEO to say that's not the case, because you do compromise things. So, I've got 2 wonderful children, 5 grandchildren, and a great wife for sort of 35 years. And I was really lucky because I missed so many birthdays, graduations, missed so many events, 3 years in India, 3 years in China, 3 years in Africa, missed a lot. And, as you get a bit more grey hair, you in retrospect, you look back and think, wow, I missed that. Now I get to the grandkids' graduations, and one of them might be playing the violin, and I'll try and get there. So I do think that you do have a bit of retrospectively look back and think, maybe I wouldn't have been as compromising to the family as what I was. They knew I worked hard and they knew I wanted to look after them. They never regret that, but they do, I think, deep down say that, Dad missed my footy grand final. So I think that would be the sort of first regret. I think the second regret I had is that you do have to make some tough decisions, and that affects people.
Yes.
They're decisions in making people redundant. They're decisions in making tough decisions that are going to impact people's personal well-being and livelihood. And if you take those comfortably, or you don't feel any regret about them, then I don't think you're a good person. So I think you always feel regretful for people that you've had to make redundant or exit or sack, or changes that you've made. And business has always been about, unfortunately, making tough decisions.
Yeah.
If you're comfortable with them, there's something wrong with you. So I think they're probably the 2 learnings that I got, that I think it's regretful of what you had to do to make the right call. In Africa, that business was under enormous distress. We did a lot of redundancies. When you make someone redundant in Africa with limited social security, you're actually making 17 people in the family redundant on average. And so they're tough decisions you have to make, and you have to regret those. You knew you did them for the right reasons, but you did them, unfortunately, with the wrong outcomes. So I think that would be, that's a good example of where you always feel bad about those. But I do think that, you do go with very many regrets, and you try and repair some of those as you go forward, and maybe you're a little bit softer, a little bit more conditioned, and you try and catch up, if you like, with the family for the things you missed.
And I think you put it beautifully. I mean, it is that weight that is humbling that comes with the responsibility of the role.
It is exactly right.
It is.
It is quite a heavy weight that people underestimate as well.
Yeah. Bernie, thank you so much for joining us. So I have actually two more questions. One of the things I asked was about self-leadership and self-care. Mm-hmm. And your response to that was that you escape for a few hours each week. Now, I don't expect you to share where, because it will hardly be an escape if we know where, but how do you manage that?
Oh, I have a simple rule that I turn my phone off about 1 to 1:30 on a Saturday afternoon and turn it back on at 5 o'clock. I go to the local pub. I'll have a bet on the races, a couple of beers, watch the races, watch the footy, veg out, and that's my main form of escapism. Sure, I walk occasionally some mornings, but that's my time, and that's probably pretty limited, but at the end, everybody knows it's my time.
Yeah, brilliant. Fantastic. So, and my final question I ask everybody, given the name of the podcast, is what does brave feminine leadership mean to you, and do you think it needs to change?
Oh, I think it raises the profile of feminine leadership or female leadership by adding an adjective or phrase or two adjectives to it, which is brave, because of the need to be brave to be successful in a world that has a lot of biasnesses, and feminine meaning that, in my interpretation, you don't have to become a bloke to be a leader. And they're the two, and when I thought about the question, I thought they're the two adjectives have a visual effect. And the visual effect is brave because you're pushing against an ocean against you, and feminine because you're still staying true to yourself to be able to become a leader. And so to me, it's a reflection of what's needed to be able to repair, I'll use the word, the biasness of the past, and ensure that people stay focused on the true value and the opportunity of brave feminine leadership that exists today.
Bernie, what a beautiful answer. That answer is going to stay with me long after we have the conversation. Thank you so much for joining our conversation. I'm thoroughly appreciative, and I know that it will resonate so strongly.
Thanks, Melissa. I really enjoyed the opportunity.